The morning of October 25, 1944. The Philippine Sea stretched out under a thin haze of smoke and salt spray. Aboard the Japanese aircraft carrier Zuikaku, one of the last survivors of the once mighty Kido Butai, Captain Takeo Matsuda adjusted his binoculars as torpedo bombers lined the flight deck. The air smelled of oil and desperation. Mechanics tightened cowling bolts with grease-blackened hands. Deck crews wrestled with oxygen torpedoes silver, heavy, immaculate, sliding them into the bellies of Nakajima B5N and WWII Tenzan bombers under a harsh tropical sun. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding what Tokyo called the Northern Force, had already given his pilots the words he believed would mark a turning of fate. This is the decisive battle. The spirit of the samurai will prevail where steel cannot. Radio Tokyo would later replay fragments of his address to the fleet, calling his torpedo aviators unstoppable blades of the Emperor. The confidence was not entirely hollow. For 3 years, Japanese torpedo bombers had embodied a terrifying precision few Western sailors could comprehend. At Pearl Harbor, at the Java Sea, at the Indian Ocean, their low-altitude strikes had torn through Allied ships that seemed helpless before their skill. American and British survivors alike spoke of the eerie calm with which Japanese pilots came in at mast height, weaving through anti-aircraft fire, dropping their torpedoes at near-suicidal range, yet almost never missing. Those successes had hardened into doctrine, that no amount of enemy fire could fully stop a determined air attack if the pilots were prepared to die. By late 1944, that belief had evolved into something darker and infinitely more desperate. In Japan's naval general, staff in Tokyo, the phrase Shugeki Tokubetsu Kogekitai Special Attack Units had entered everyday language. Kamikaze attacks were no longer isolated acts of last resort, but formalized operations of state. The assumption behind them was simple and terrible. If a torpedo or bomb could not sink the enemy, the pilot's body itself would. What few Japanese officers understood, however, was that the Americans had already fielded a weapon that would render that entire philosophy obsolete. The variable time fuse, the VT fuse, had transformed anti-aircraft warfare from statistical luck into near-automatic precision. But in the autumn of 1944, those aboard Zuikaku, Zuiho, and Chitose believed that Japanese aerial tactics still possessed a spiritual edge no machine could match. Tokyo's war bulletins boasted of storm-diving angels, capable of breaking the enemy's will. Naval attaché in Switzerland and Sweden reported hearing Allied diplomats describe the kamikazes as a new terror of the sea. Admiral Takehiro Onishi, the so-called father of the kamikaze, told his staff that mechanical weapons may evolve, but no machine surpasses the resolve of a human willing to die. He meant it literally. By this time, Japan's conventional air power had been bled white. The great carrier aviator corps that had struck Pearl Harbor was gone lost over Midway. The Solomons, the Marianas, the men who now climbed into torpedo bombers in 1944 were often teenagers with under 100 flight hours. The planes themselves were deteriorating relics, their engines patched, their torpedoes hand-filled. Yet, inside every squadron briefing tent, a myth persisted that the low-altitude torpedo run, perfected at Pearl Harbor, was a weapon no enemy science could fully counter. The idea had roots in the Navy's technical culture. Japanese engineers had built the world's first reliable shallow-water torpedo by using wooden fins that broke away after entry, stabilizing the weapon in just 12 feet of depth. That innovation had stunned Allied observers in 1941. It convinced many within Japan's Navy that technological superiority was already achieved, that the West was reactive, Japan inventive. When news reached surviving admirals in late 1944 that the Americans had deployed a new kind of fuse, one that could detonate shells without direct contact, few paid it serious attention. Reports from surviving bomber crews described American ships surrounded by invisible bursts that filled the sky with deadly fragments, but such claims were dismissed as exaggerations caused by combat stress or proximity to tracer fire. Vice Admiral Onishi's staff summarized the assessment bluntly. No fuse can think. It cannot see. It cannot strike a man who flies with the gods. The irony was devastating, for even as Japan's torpedo squadrons prepared for their so-called final decisive blows, the science behind the VT fuse had quietly matured into the single most lethal defensive technology of the Pacific War. By the time of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, the US Navy had fully integrated VT-fused shells into the 5-inch and 40mm batteries of its major warships. Every destroyer, cruiser and carrier bristled with radar-directed guns whose shells now exploded automatically when within about 70 feet of an aircraft. The difference was invisible to the naked eye but fatal in its effect. Prior to the VT fuse, the odds of hitting a fast-moving aircraft were roughly 1 in 2,000 rounds. After its adoption, gunnery officers reported kill ratios approaching 1 in 40, an improvement that multiplied the defensive firepower of the fleet several dozen times. The first Japanese pilots to encounter this new wall of steel did not understand what had changed. Many believed American gunners had developed superhuman accuracy. Reports from returning crews described aircraft simply disintegrating mid-air, torn apart by unseen bursts long before reaching torpedo drop range. To the men aboard Japanese carriers, such stories seemed incredible until October 25, 1944, when Admiral Ozawa's Bait Fleet met the US Third Fleet east of Cape Engano. At dawn, Zuikaku launched its first strike, 25 aircraft half-torpedo bombers, half-fighters. Only 6 would return. American radar operators detected them over 100 miles out. By the time the Japanese aircraft closed to within 30 miles, the defensive fire from the carrier Essex and her escorts filled the sky with thousands of self-detonating shells. The gunners did not need to guess altitude or distance. Their shells exploded automatically, enveloping the formation in concentric spheres of shrapnel. Commander Jimmy Tach, famous for developing the Tach weave earlier in the war, described the new defense succinctly. It was like watching a solid wall rise in the air. They didn't get through it, they disappeared into it. The Japanese Navy's faith in torpedo tactics, so long the symbol of its technological pride, was about to collide with a scientific reality. It could neither comprehend nor counter. And from that collision would emerge one of the cruelest paradoxes of the war, that the same spiritual doctrine that demanded Japanese pilots die for victory would ensure they died for nothing at all. When dawn broke on October 26, 1944, the Philippine Sea was littered with oil slicks and burning wreckage. The carrier Zuikaku, pride of the Pearl Harbor raid, now lay crippled and listing. Smoke curled from her shattered flight deck. Below decks, sailors sang fragments of the imperial anthem as seawater hissed against the hot steel. By mid-morning, she rolled over and slipped beneath the waves. With her went the last illusion that Japan's carrier aviation could alter, the war's outcome. But Tokyo refused to see it that way. In the broadcast hours after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japanese radio hailed the noble sacrifices of airmen who had turned their aircraft into divine wind. For the first time, the word kamikaze divine wind was spoken as policy, not metaphor. In Tokyo, Admiral Takeo Onishi drafted his now infamous proposal, the formal creation of Tokubetsu Kogekitai special attack units. His reasoning was brutally simple. If one plane with one bomb can sink one ship, we can reverse the war by the devotion of our pilots. But the arithmetic of devotion could not compete with the physics of the VT fuse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By late 1944, every major U.S. fleet unit in the Pacific carried proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells. Developed in secret by the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance and the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, the VT fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter and receiver. When a shell came near an aircraft, the reflected signal triggered detonation, no direct hit required. Captain George M. Neal of the USS Missouri later explained it best. Before, you fired a sky full of guesswork. After the VT came aboard, you fired knowledge. The effect was transformative. Allied ships no longer sprayed the air blindly. Their fire formed concentric layers of controlled explosions, each tuned to the altitude and approach angle of incoming aircraft. The result was a literal curtain of invisible steel. For Japanese pilots, the first encounters were inexplicable. Lieutenant Saburo Uenishi, a veteran of Rabaul, wrote in his diary later recovered from his effects. We saw nothing, there were no tracers, just flashes around us, and the wings vanished. October 25, 1944, the same day Zuikaku fell, marked the first organized kamikaze attacks of the war. The center of the onslaught was USS St. Lo, a light escort carrier supporting the landings at later. Lieutenant Yukio Seki led the first wave. His last words, recorded by a maintenance officer, were eerily calm. Japan's future is dark, but if we can sink one ship, it may still shine. At Jixianj 3 am Seiki 0 smashed into St. Lo's flight deck, detonating her bomb load. The carrier went down in less than an hour, one of the few direct successes of the kamikaze campaign. For Tokyo, St. Lo was proof of concept. For the U.S. Navy, it was an anomaly soon corrected. In the following weeks, hundreds of kamikazes would dive at radar-directed fleets around Leyte and Mindoro. The U.S. Navy responded with overlapping fire control networks. Destroyers formed picket screens. Radar operators tracked incoming bogies up to 70 miles out, and when they entered the kill zone, batteries armed with VT shells opened fire. The results were mathematically horrific for the attackers. By early 1945, the kamikaze losses defied comprehension. Out of an estimated 3 kamikaze sorties launched during the Philippine campaign and Okinawa, over 90% were destroyed before reaching their targets. The new defensive ecosystem, radar early warning, combat air patrols, and the VT fuse created a kill ratio Japan could not survive. R.U.S. Navy after-action report from Okinawa summarized it bluntly. They came in low, they came in high, they came in clouds, but every approach ended the same. Our guns got there first. Radar-guided directors automatically synchronized the firing of multiple ships. One destroyer's gunnery officer noted, "You could hear them before you saw them, then the VT shells would bloom around them like a storm of white flowers." Those flowers were 5-inch shells, detonating in mid-air, showering fragments through aircraft aluminum and human flesh alike. Pilots rarely saw what hit them. At Okinawa, the proximity-fused guns of task, Force 58 alone destroyed over Dwa. Oshim set Japanese aircraft more than half of all those launched. For the surviving Japanese commanders, the reports were unspeakable. Admiral Matome Ugaki wrote in his diary just weeks before the surrender, "It is as if heaven itself rejects our resolve. The Americans' fire kills even the wind." As losses mounted, Japanese planners shifted the narrative from strategy to spirituality. Newspapers praised kamikaze pilots as human bombs of divine will. Propaganda films showed them smiling beside their aircraft, cherry blossoms swirling around them in cinematic purity. But the reality, captured in US combat camera footage and the recollections of surviving sailors, was mechanical and merciless. Each new wave of attackers faced denser flak than the last. US ships expended hundreds of thousands of VT shells over Okinawa, so many that some gunners said the sky looked like boiling metal. The Japanese Navy called these deaths gyokusai, honorable annihilation. To the Americans firing upward, it was simply target practice made perfect by physics. By mid-1945, Japanese admirals no longer boasted of unstoppable bombers. They barely spoke of them at all. Carrier divisions no longer existed. The planes that launched from Kyushu airfields were often stripped of radios to save fuel weight. Many pilots could not navigate back, even if they survived their attack run. American ships, ringed by radar and VT-fused flak, became floating fortresses. Kamikazes that once terrified crews now burned out of the sky before most gunners even adjusted their aim. The psychological shift was profound. Where sailors at Leyte had prayed and ducked, those at Okinawa watched with grim efficiency. Seaman Harold Moore of the USS Bunker Hill recalled, "By then, we didn't fear them anymore. We pitied them. You could see the young faces before the explosions." When Japan finally surrendered in August, 1945, the tally was absolute. The Kamikaze campaign had destroyed roughly 30 American sailors and 34 ships, but at the cost of nearly 0 pilots and aircraft, most lost to the VT fuse and radar fire. Admiral Onishi, who had created the special attack units, committed ritual suicide soon after hearing of Japan's defeat. His suicide note read, "I wish to apologize to the souls of the youth who died believing my words." In the final irony of the Pacific War, the weapon that shattered the myth of unstoppable sacrifice was not an atomic bomb or a battleship. It was a small radio circuit, barely the size of a light bulb. The VT fuse had transformed the sea into a shield. Every detonation in the sky was a mathematical judgment, proof that human willpower alone could not overcome technology once science turned its gaze upward. To the Japanese Navy, the war ended not only in defeat but in revelation, that faith without feedback, courage without calculation, and sacrifice without understanding were not strength, they were extinction. As one U.S. officer put it while watching the last kamikaze of the war dissolve into fragments above Okinawa, he never even got close, the fuse got there first. Tokyo, August 15, 1945. The air over the ruined city hung still, as if the very wind feared to move. Loudspeakers crackled, and the voice of Emperor Hirohito, unheard by his people until that moment, announced the termination of hostilities. Across Japan, soldiers wept in silence. Some bowed toward the palace, others simply sat where they were, too hollow to move. For the first time in its history, the Imperial Navy, once the pride of the nation, no longer existed. The admirals who had once called their torpedo bombers unstoppable blades of the Emperor now faced a mirror darker than defeat. A realization that the age of heroic death had been replaced by the age of electronic precision. In the months after surrender, U.S. occupation forces catalogued Japanese weapons programs. What they found was a military still chasing myths: glider bombs without guidance, suicide submarines, aircraft built faster than pilots could be trained. What they did not find was a countermeasure to the VT fuse, not even the faint beginnings of one. It was the purest demonstration of asymmetry, faith versus feedback, intuition versus instrumentation. The scientists who had developed the proximity fuse back in the United States were equally stunned. They had worked in secrecy, fearing it might fail in combat. Now, reading after-action reports from Leyte and Okinawa, they realized they had built something as decisive as radar or the atomic bomb, yet quieter, invisible, and deeply humane in its effect. A weapon that prevented death by keeping enemies at a distance. Merle Tuve, the physicist who led the project, later reflected, "The fuse's greatest achievement was not in what it destroyed, but in what it saved. For every aircraft stopped in the sky, a ship and hundreds of men lived to go home." In post-war Japan, a different kind of rebuilding began. Engineers who once calculated torpedo angles now studied radio circuits and transistor design. Factories that had produced aircraft engines shifted to cameras, microscopes, and precision instruments. The discipline that once refined the shallow-running torpedo found new purpose in perfect lenses, silent watch movements, and compact radios. Within 2 decades, Japan's mastery of precision electronics would astonish the world again, this time not in battle, but in peace. Historians often note that the same obsession with reliability that drove wartime weapons research became the backbone of Japan's industrial miracle. The lesson of defeat was absorbed into a cultural redefinition. Perfection was no longer sought in dying flawlessly, but in building flawlessly. As one post-war engineer, formerly a naval technician, put it, "We learned that a circuit could be more powerful than courage if it was honest." The VT fuse itself faded quietly into history. After the war, its existence was declassified, and its principles went on to shape radar altimeters, guided missiles, and modern air defense systems. But few outside military history circles remember that it began as a palm-sized radio tube sealed against shock and moisture, built by workers who didn't even know what they were making. Its impact rippled far beyond the Pacific. In Europe, proximity fuses helped end the V-Yidden flying bomb threat over London. In Korea and Vietnam, refined versions defended UN troops against artillery shells. And in every missile defense network that followed, from the Cold War to the present day, the fuse's logic endures: detect, calculate, and act faster than the human eye can see. It was, in essence, the birth of machine reflex the moment warfare itself began thinking in microseconds. In Japan's collective memory, the word kamikaze eventually shed its wartime meaning. Today, it evokes not divine wrath but tragic devotion, an era when idealism outran understanding. At Yasukuni Shrine and Chiran Peace Museum, letters from young pilots are displayed beside fragments of their aircraft. Many wrote not of hatred, but of longing to protect families, to save Japan, to find meaning amid hopelessness. One note, written by a 19-year-old trainee named Katsuhiko Nakamura, reads, "If only our enemies could see us as human, they might not need to kill us. If only we could see them as human, we might not need to die." It is a line that transcends sides, and perhaps explains why this story still matters. The Pacific War ended in August, 1945, with Japan's surrender. But the war of ideas, the contest between will and reason, between belief and measurement, ended in the silent detonation of thousands of proximity-fused shells long before that. Each burst in the sky over Leyte or Okinawa marked a moment when the modern world quietly arrived, when invisible waves decided the outcome of human courage. In that sense, the VT fuse was both the final weapon of one era and the first weapon of another. The age of the samurai spirit had ended. The age of science had begun. In the end, history doesn't remember who shouted the loudest, it remembers who listened. The admirals had believed their torpedo bombers unstoppable. The pilots had believed courage alone could pierce the sky. But it was a tiny radio wave, born in a lab thousands of miles away, that whispered the truth first. Understanding is stronger than belief. Fade out on archival footage of calm seas, gun barrels resting, the Pacific shimmering under morning light. The war is over. The silence, at last, is complete. When the guns finally fell silent in the Pacific in the late summer of 1945, the Pacific Ocean, once a chessboard of carriers, airfields, and floating fortresses, became an open mirror again. What had been a battlefield stretching 6,000 miles was now a laboratory of lessons learned in blood, metal, and radio waves. For the men who had watched proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells tear kamikazes from the sky, it was impossible not to feel the paradox. A device invented to kill had preserved thousands of lives. The engineers behind it, many of whom had never left American shores, watched with quiet astonishment as their work reshaped the physics of warfare. The VT fuse, born from a desperate wartime need to make anti-aircraft fire meaningful, had proven not merely a success, it had rewritten the entire relationship between electronics, ordnance, and control. In the span of 5 years, the human eye had been displaced by invisible sensors, and instinct had yielded to computation. The Japanese called their late-war pilots tokotai, special attack units. Their commanders spoke of divine wind kamikaze, as if faith alone could blind radar or deflect proximity shells. Yet the unseen pulse of radio, honed by physicists at the Carnegie Institution, Western Electric, and the Radiation Laboratory, cut through myth and mist alike. Every kamikaze destroyed by a VT-fused shell was not only a tragedy averted, it was a signal transmitted across the next century. By 1946, the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance had already convened a committee to evaluate the continuing application of variable-time fuse technology in peacetime development. It was, in effect, the opening note of the Cold War's technological symphony. From the very laboratories that had hardened vacuum tubes to survive, 20,000 gravities came the first circuits that would one day guide missiles, track satellites, and form the nervous system of modern defense. The first transfer of wartime fuse research into post-war technology began at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. Scientists there realized that the VT fuse's compact, ruggedized electronics were a blueprint for all future miniaturized radio devices. The fuse had forced the development of subminiature vacuum tubes barely an inch, high tubes that could endure shock, vibration, and extremes of temperature. Those same tubes would power the first guided missile control systems, portable radios for the Korean War, and even the primitive computers that would calculate ballistic trajectories in the early 1950s. Merle Tuve, whose Section T at the Carnegie Institution had been the intellectual cradle of the proximity fuse, declined every offer of military honors. He insisted that the real lesson was not the weapon's destructive power, but its proof that scientists could compress an entire radar set into the tip of a bullet. His laboratory notebooks from 1940 to 1945 read less like a weapons engineer's ledger and more like an electrical Rosetta Stone, page after page of frequency curves, vacuum seals, and resonant circuits that would quietly seed the transistor revolution. In parallel, engineers at Ferriers, Bell Laboratories and RCA, who had produced millions of proximity fuses under conditions of absolute secrecy, discovered that their wartime production methods were now the most advanced in the world. In an era when Europe lay in ruins, America's electronics industry stood 10 years ahead. The processes used to make ruggedized glass tubes and precision capacitors were adapted wholesale into the first mass-produced televisions and early radar altimeters for civil aviation. Yet the legacy of the VT fuse was not confined to industry. It rewrote doctrine. During the first months of the Korean War in 1950, American gunners found themselves once again facing massed aerial attack, this time from Soviet-built Yak fighters and Tudwa bombers flown by North Korean and Chinese pilots. The same 5-inch naval shells that had shredded kamikazes now formed a steel canopy over Incheon and Pusan. Reports from the Navy's Task Force 77 noted that proximity-fused flak accounted for over 70% of all aerial kills within gun range, a statistic almost identical to late-war Pacific. Performance. Behind those statistics lay a subtle shift. Warfare had entered the electronic domain. The same Doppler principle that measured a kamikaze's approach would soon measure the heartbeat of an intercontinental missile. By 1953, the proximity fuse's logic circuits had been adapted into radar proximity sensors for Nike surface-to-air missiles. The first guided interceptors capable of striking targets at supersonic speed, the fuse, once dismissed as a desperate improvisation, had become the seed of precision. The Japanese, meanwhile, returned to a homeland reduced to ashes and paradox. In Tokyo, engineers who had once built oxygen torpedoes and Type 99 dive bombers now found themselves repairing telephone exchanges and designing vacuum tube radios for civilian use. American occupation authorities, under General Douglas MacArthur, made a deliberate decision. The same scientific discipline that had fueled Japan's militarism would now fuel its reconstruction. Laboratories once devoted to fuses and fission were redirected toward industry, communication, and consumer electronics. By the mid-1950s, Japanese companies such as Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo, later renamed Sony, began experimenting with transistors imported under American license. The engineers understood their significance immediately. The transistor was, in essence, a solid-state proximity fuse. A device that could sense, amplify, and respond faster than any mechanical system. Many of the young scientists at Sony and Toshiba had studied under professors who had once worked in wartime naval laboratories. In their post-war notebooks, one can trace the lineage from the radio wave detonator to the transistor radio from the sky filled with explosions to one filled with music. Back in the United States, Section T's wartime descendants morphed into the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins. There, engineers who had once tuned fuse circuits by hand now found themselves designing guidance computers for the Navy's first surface-to-air missile, the Terrier. They faced the same challenges as Tuve's team had in 1940: shock, vibration, acceleration, and reliability under fire. The Terrier's nose housed a radar seeker that was, in principle, a giant VT fuse, a self-contained sensor that listened for echoes, computed proximity, and triggered detonation. By 1955, the Terrier and its successors, Tartar, Talos, and later the Standard Missile, formed a defensive ring around American carrier groups. The kamikaze problem, once solved by fuses in the gun barrels, was now solved hundreds of miles from the fleet by electronic eyes in the sky. The proximity fuse's conceptual DNA had evolved from sensing a plane's approach to predicting a missile's trajectory. For Japan, the transformation was existential. The same nation whose admirals had once declared torpedo bombers unstoppable now built radar systems for civilian air traffic control. By 1964, when Tokyo hosted the Summer Olympics, the skies above the city were guarded not by Zeros, but by American-made Nike missile batteries linked to radar proximity sensors, descendants of the very VT fuse that had ended the kamikaze. It was a poetic symmetry. Technology that had once annihilated Japanese pilots now protected Japanese civilians. The Cold War amplified this symmetry into a paradox of global scale. Both superpowers adopted the VT fuse's principle that proximity and sensing defined survival and extended it into space. Soviet scientists developed radar proximity detonators for their SA-2 missiles, used infamously in the 1960 U-2 incident that downed France's Gary Powers. American engineers, for their part, refined fuse technology for nuclear weapons. The W-47 warhead of the Polaris missile, deployed in 1960, used a radar proximity sensor to ensure detonation at the optimal altitude above target. It was here that the moral calculus deepened. The proximity fuse, once praised for saving lives by improving accuracy, had become an instrument of existential threat. Physicists like Tuve, who had once worked without hesitation, now questioned whether precision was a blessing or a curse. In congressional testimony during 1959, Tuve stated, "We learned to make war efficient, but efficiency is not humanity." He retired from weapons work soon after, returning to geophysics mapping magnetic fields instead of fusing warheads. His words resonated quietly among the next generation of engineers. Many of them had grown up in the shadow of the mushroom cloud, yet were inspired by the same discipline that had created the VT fuse: precision, miniaturization, feedback control. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Instrumentation Laboratory, a young engineer named Charles Stark Draper studied fuse circuitry as a model for inertial navigation. By 1962, his team had built guidance computers for the Apollo program, ensuring spacecraft could detect and correct their own position, a proximity measurement at cosmic scale. The link was unmistakable. The same mathematics that once measured the distance between a shell and a plane now measured the distance between Earth and the Moon. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the ocean itself remembered. Wrecks of Japanese aircraft still dotted the seabed around Okinawa and later Gulf. Many bore yagged holes from 5-inch proximity-fused shells. Marine archaeologists in later decades would retrieve fragments of those shells, their shattered fuses still faintly magnetic. When analyzed under electron microscopes in the 1980s, the glass in those fuses revealed the strength of their design microbubbles, sealed under pressures that would have crushed ordinary components. They were, in every sense, the forerunners of modern microelectronics. In the American archives, the numbers told their own story. By war's end, over 22 million VT fuses had been manufactured, each containing more than 100 precision components. The project consumed $400 million, roughly equivalent to $6 billion in 21st century value, and employed over 150,000 workers across 70 factories. It was one of the largest coordinated scientific endeavors of the war, rivaled only by the Manhattan Project. Yet unlike the atomic bomb, its fruits were immediately adaptable to peace. Civilian aviation adopted radio altimeters derived directly from proximity fuse oscillators. Weather balloons used miniature transmitters based on the same rugged tubes. Even automatic garage door openers, first patented in 1954, owed their existence to fuse-based sensing circuits. The very concept of the smart device, an object that senses and reacts to its environment, could trace its lineage to the black-tipped fuse that once rode atop an artillery shell. As the Cold War matured into the space age, the concept of proximity became the heart of deterrence itself. Radar networks like the distant early warning line stretched across the Arctic, each station a colossal VT fuse waiting to detect Soviet bombers. Satellites orbited overhead using proximity sensors to dock and to detonate. The invisible pulse that had first ignited shells over the Philippines now measured the heartbeat of the planet. For Japan, the lesson endured not as shame, but as transformation. In the laboratories of Hitachi and Mitsubishi, the engineers who once studied the geometry of torpedo attacks now developed sonar and radar for oceanographic research. By the 1970s, Japanese universities taught control theory, the mathematics of proximity and feedback, as the foundation of robotics. The same equations that had once guided kamikazes into ships now guided industrial arms with micron precision. What had been a weaponized principle became a philosophy of harmony between sensing and action. In the United States, military planners gradually recognized that the true legacy of the VT fuse was not its lethality, but its reliability. The idea that electronics could be trusted under battlefield conditions paved the way for the digitization of command and control. The Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, or SAGE, deployed in the late 1950s, linked radar stations to giant computers that tracked enemy aircraft in real time. The system's heart, its radar proximity data filters, operated on logic circuits directly descended from fuse technology. By the dawn of the 1980s, when microchips replaced tubes entirely, the last engineers who had built proximity fuses were retiring. Some lived long enough to see their designs miniaturized into microchips, 1,000 times smaller yet infinitely more powerful. When asked what they felt, most echoed Tuve's humility. One veteran engineer from RCA replied simply, "It was never about killing. It was about timing, about understanding when two things meet." That understanding defined the second half of the 20th century. The Cold War's entire balance of terror rested on the precision of proximity, knowing how close an enemy was, how long a missile had to fly, how near a warhead must detonate. The logic that saved a destroyer from a kamikaze in 1945 now prevented world annihilation in 1962. Even in cultural memory, the echo persisted. Wartime footage of proximity-fused flak exploding around kamikazes became standard stock in documentaries, always accompanied by somber narration about the moment technology outpaced bravery. For the Japanese public, such images were painful reminders, yet also markers of how far the nation had traveled from worshipping destruction to mastering precision without violence. When historians in the 21st century re-evaluated the VT fuse, they ranked it among the three decisive technologies of World War II. Radar, the atomic bomb, and the proximity fuse, three manifestations of invisible energy that changed the visible world. Radar gave sight, the bomb gave fear, and the fuse gave control. Each reshaped human behavior, forcing a reconsideration of what it meant to fight, to measure, and to survive. Standing today at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, one can find a small, unremarkable cylinder displayed beside a kamikaze's recovered engine. The placard reads, "Variable Time Fuse, Type VT. Mark 32 credited with saving tens of thousands of lives." Nearby, A quote from an anonymous sailor at Okinawa. We stopped praying for courage and started praying for circuits that worked. It is perhaps the most human summary of the 20th century's transformation. In a single generation, faith in divine wind gave way to faith in engineering. The sea that once swallowed fleets now carries fiber optic cables. The sky that once rained fire now carries satellites measuring weather, distance, and time, all echoes of that same pursuit. To know proximity, to command timing, to make uncertainty obey. And so, the legacy of the VT fuse endures not only in the circuitry of modern defense, but in every device that senses and responds, every radar that warns, every spacecraft that docks by radio reflection. The unseen pulse that once ended kamikazes now synchronizes humanity itself in navigation systems, collision sensors, even the rhythm of atomic clocks that define global time. What began as a desperate answer to suicide attacks became the foundation of an age where distance, not destruction, defines power. From the laboratories of 1940 to the satellites of 2025, the same equation repeats. Energy transmitted, reflected, and interpreted. The proximity fuse did more than save ships. It taught civilization that knowledge itself could be a shield. As dawn breaks over the Pacific, the sea is quiet. The same horizon, once filled with smoke and flame, now reflects the glow of electronics and memory. The Admirals' boast, the pilot's prayer, the engineer's equation all dissolved into the same truth. Survival belongs not to those who charge blindly, but to those who can see the unseen. In that reflection lies the final irony of the Pacific War. The empire that trusted in divine wind met an enemy that trusted in invisible waves. The war ended not because men stopped fighting, but because physics rendered courage obsolete. And in the ruins of that revelation, humanity learned to measure its distance from destruction one pulse at a time. By the time the Cold War gave way to détente, the proximity fuse had long faded from public memory. It had no silhouette like the atomic bomb, no iconic image like the mushroom cloud. It was an invisible victory, a triumph of timing, not spectacle. Yet its pulse lived on, beating quietly inside every machine that measured, calculated, or responded faster than the human mind could think. In the Pacific, divers exploring wrecks near Okinawa still find fragments of those black-tipped shells resting in coral. Time has turned them into strange fossils, half weapon, half artifact. When the light hits them just right, you can still see the faint grooves of their copper bands, and if you listen through a hydrophone, the ocean itself hums faintly with the same frequency once used by those fuses, around 180 MHz, the heartbeat of mid-century radio. Historians call it the technology that quietly won the war. For every kamikaze that failed to reach its target, for every ship that survived an attack wave, there were sailors who lived to see peacetime men who built families, companies, even nations. The fuse had not only preserved lives, it had preserved possibilities. In post-war Japan, those possibilities blossomed into something extraordinary. The same generation that had watched its air fleets vanish under the precision of radar and fuses now sought mastery over precision itself. By the 1970, Japan had become a powerhouse of miniaturization. The transistor radio, the cassette player, the quartz watch, each of them, at its core, was an evolution of the wartime dream of perfect timing. Would later admit that their fascination with control systems came from childhood stories of miracle weapons, tales of how invisible waves could change the fate of entire fleets. In peaceful form, that same curiosity drove Japan's rise in electronics and robotics. Where the empire once sought divine wind, its heirs sought harmony through precision. Across the Pacific, the fuse's American creators found themselves in a strange position. Their invention had saved lives and reshaped industry, yet it was classified for years after the war. Only in the late 1950s did the public begin to hear how close the Allies had come to losing control of the skies in 1944, and how one small radio circuit had turned the tide. When the story finally broke, veterans wrote letters to newspapers, some recalling the exact moment they realized the fuses worked. One sailor from the USS Missouri described it simply, "At first we thought the gunners had become gods of aim. Then we learned it wasn't us, it was science." That realization that technology could replace divine chance marked the beginning of the modern military mind. After the war, no commander would ever again plan without asking what new sensor, what faster signal, what smaller circuit could alter the balance. The era of instinct had yielded to the era of feedback. By the late 20th century, the proximity fuse's descendants guided everything from precision bombs to Mars landers. The same Doppler principle that once detected a diving, Zero now measured spacecraft descent through alien atmospheres. Even automatic car brakes, anti-collision radars, and drones carried the same mathematical DNA. Detect, compare, react, all within milliseconds. But perhaps the fuse's most profound legacy was philosophical. It blurred the line between machine perception and human decision. When a proximity shell detonated automatically, it was the first moment in history when a weapon decided for itself when to act. From that point onward, war and automation became inseparable. Each generation of weapons grew more autonomous, radar-guided, heat-seeking, algorithm-driven, until human hands no longer pulled the trigger directly, only designed the logic that would. For those who had witnessed the fuse's first successes, this evolution was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. Admiral William Blandy, who oversaw the fuse's naval deployment, warned in a 1946 address, "We have entered the age where the trigger is thought, not touch. We must remember that technology is loyal to purpose, not to morality." Decades later, his words would echo as drones circled modern battlefields, their sensors whispering the same invisible language born in those 1940s laboratories. And yet there is beauty in the symmetry. The same invisible pulse that once commanded death now protects life. Airliners rely on radar altimeters, automatic doors use proximity sensors, and smartphones measure distance with lasers derived from the same wartime mathematics. Humanity took a weapon and, in the long arc of history, transformed it into awareness. When one looks at the Pacific today, calm, endless, reflecting the satellites above, it's almost impossible to imagine the storm that once raged across it. But the ocean remembers. On the seafloor lie the artifacts of both despair and innovation. The rusted wings of Zeros, the shattered barrels of anti-aircraft guns, the glassy remnants of radio tubes that once hummed with energy. In their silence, they whisper the story of a world that learned precision through pain. In the final years of his life, Merle Tuve was asked what he thought of his creation's legacy. He paused and said, "The fuse was not made to destroy. It was made to measure distance between danger and safety, ignorance and understanding." Perhaps that is the truest summary of the 20th century. Humanity spent half of it learning how to sense death approaching, and the other half learning how to sense each other instead. Every proximity sensor, every guidance system, every smart device is a faint echo of that wartime lesson. That survival depends not on force, but on perception. When the story of the Pacific War is told, the focus often rests on courage, the kamikazes' sacrifice, the sailors' fear, the engineers' resolve. But beneath all that, emotion lies the quieter truth that changed everything. An invisible wave, travelling at the speed of light, that once meant destruction, but now powers connection. The same principle that once guided flak bursts now guides humanity's global heartbeat, radio signals from satellites timing our navigation, synchronizing our clocks, and linking billions of minds. The invisible pulse that ended a war became the rhythm of a world finally at peace. As dusk falls over the Pacific, the sea glows with the reflection of countless digital lights from ships, planes, and satellites. Each signal, each sensor, each measurement a distant descendant of that first fuse. What began as a weapon of precision became a language of understanding, and perhaps that is how the story should end, not with an explosion, but with a signal. Not with fire, but with awareness. Not with proximity to death, but with proximity to one another. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.